What's up guys, and welcome to today's video and the asylum that was made for 240 patients but ended up holding 2,400 mentally ill patients, called the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Talking about the life of this asylum and the story behind it, we have to talk about some of the main people who brought this asylum, as well as many other asylums in America, to life. And one of those people was Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix was born into a crazy life, and sadly, an unconventional one. Her father was abusive, and again sadly, her mother was mentally ill. And at the age of 39, she would visit a jail, and here she would see how mentally ill people were treated at the time, such as being chained to walls and put into cages. And seeing the mentally ill people in this jail would push her, along with a lot of work, to finally convince state legislators in Massachusetts to put more money towards the better treatment of the mentally ill. Along with Dorothea Dix was a man named Kirkbride, and his theory of the building is the cure. And in this theory, he thought that if the building was constructed right and had the right features, it could help cure the mentally ill. And some of these features would include long corridors, lots of fresh air, and lots of sunlight, which would help explain why the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is made and built the way it is, with again the long corridors and lots of beautiful structures and overall just beautiful architecture. But the theory wasn't as right as he thought it was. They started construction on the building in 1858 and would be able to complete the south wing as well as the central building's basement before one of the biggest events in American history took place. And 3 years after they started construction, the Civil War broke out in America. The Civil War would come to the construction area of the asylum by the 7th Ohio Infantry. This infantry would actually be led by Bernard Tyler, who would make the asylum and the grounds around the asylum home for his infantry. This led to camps being set up all the way around the asylum, and parts of the asylum being used for the war, such as stables being built into them and places for guns and all types of stuff for the war. But this also meant that this area and infantry around the asylum traded hands a lot throughout the war, and a lot of people in the war died around the asylum. After the war, the town finished building the rest of the asylum, and because the asylum brought not only jobs for construction but also jobs within the asylum, it was one of the few towns in America and in the region that was able to be financially stable after the Civil War. And by 1864, the doors were open to those dubbed mentally ill. And by the 1900s, the beginning idea of this asylum was no longer a thing, and the better treatment of the mentally ill was no longer a thing. And while the original idea of the asylum was no longer a thing, people in America were starting to begin to think that asylum wasn't an okay word to use to call a place. So it would end up being called the Weston State Hospital. And in this name is when it went overboard and ended up holding 2,400 patients within the small asylum that was made for 240 patients. And here's where the story gets even worse. Those who were dubbed mentally ill, like I said before, were sent to this asylum because that's what was okay for the time. That's what people thought people with any mental disability or issue should be sent, or anything else that could be cured easily. They were outcasted and sent to asylums like this one. And because the need and demands for asylums was so high, it ended up holding, like I said, the 2,400 patients. And this meant that people were chained to the walls, and this meant people were put in cages, and there were beds lined across the walls because there was no way to treat these people like they should be, like human beings. There was no way to treat all these 2,400 people like human beings because of the overcapacity that was being brought to the asylum. And another cure for what they thought was the mentally ill was lobotomies. And as this was used at a lot of asylums, it was especially used at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. And this is when they stick an ice pick, which at the time they did use an ice pick at this asylum, into the corner of the eye or through the nose and scramble around the front of your brain to make you more normal and not be yourself, and more of a person that they thought was mentally stable for everyday society. And if you look up pictures online, you can see before and after of lobotomies taking place. And along with all this other things that were horrible at the asylum, the overall condition was just declining like crazy. And in 1935, the fire broke out inside the asylum and again decreased the conditions and the livability of and the ethics of keeping these humans trapped inside of a place that they didn't deserve to be in. And in 1994, because of people realizing that this wasn't ethical to treat humans like this and keep them in these horrible conditions in cages and other things like that, and the building being in a horrible condition, as well as a decline in patients, the asylum ended up closing doors. And while looking back at the history of the asylum, there was a lot that happened and a lot of very crazy things that happened at the asylum, and just, again, a very broad history. But when looking back and reading about the history, two main things stuck out to me about the asylum. And one of those things was that the infamous Charles Manson actually stayed at the asylum for a short amount of time, which is crazy thinking that he was there. And another thing that stuck out for me about the history was a woman who, after the Civil War, was diagnosed as being insane, was admitted into the asylum. And while she was admitted into the asylum, she forgot that she was pregnant, and she would later end up giving birth to a girl named Lily. And hours after her mother gave birth to the baby girl named Lily, she would end up dying. And she is said to still haunt the asylum today, where Lily is said to still play with the toys within the room and said to turn on and off flashlights of people who are brave enough to go in. And while this may be the end of the video, this is definitely not the end of the history with the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum or series. Oh my gosh, there it is.
That might be our cue to go.
And then finally, they put them underneath the bed and jumped on, or...
I don't have to, it hurts, I'm listening down there.